Hey Chris, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going?
Not
Doing
bad,
well.
not bad. It's funny, we've already been talking for like 15 minutes, so this is very artificial, but
Yeah.
I am in Canada and I'm not bad. You're in Southern California and I think you're doing okay. You just got your doctorate, finished your
Yeah,
defense.
I just defended about little less than 2 weeks ago, passed with no revisions, so I am done. Done, which feels nice.
Yeah, I
Feels
think
really good.
building up to it, it's a lot of pressure, but when you're done, it's almost just like taking a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
funny
it
for,
was I wasn't super stressed out about the defense
yeah.
because I'd heard here in the American system it's more of a formality. Like if your dissertation passed, then it passed.
Hmm.
You don't have to worry about that. So that was less stressful than comps were for me. Comps were extremely stressful going into it.
Yeah, that might be
But all that's
true.
behind me now. All that is
Yeah,
behind me now.
that's true. Now you just have regular life, which is not stressful.
Not at all. Not
No.
at all.
Now you, in your dissertation, I don't know the title, but you wrote on anthropology, theological anthropology. I think
Yeah.
atonement, or was that a different topic from your other writings?
That's part of it. It's not the main focus, but it makes its way in there. Yeah.
So why did you? I mean, maybe you didn't have this big picture as you started, but why now, when you on reflection, like why do you think theological anthropology is so important? Why is that something that you spent, I don't know, 3 or 4 years on? And
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
should we
So
care?
the title of my dissertation was Discerning Humanity,
Hmm.
the promise of Christology for developing T.F. Torrance's anthropology. Now, there's a lot of different like working elements in that title, but yeah, my interest in theological anthropology actually came out of an interest in T.F. Torrance's Doctrine of Atonement. So I came across T.F. Torrance in an atonement seminar with Oliver Crisp back when I was a master's student. And sort of what I saw there was that he had a really interesting take on, or I would find out later, an interesting take on what human nature was. So that sort of sent me into this trajectory of looking at theological anthropology. So you asked the question like, why is it so important? So for Torrance, he has this like one throwaway line. That's not exactly like a throwaway line, but he says that there's no point in theology that's more relevant today than theological anthropology, which is a pretty big statement. It's interesting though because he doesn't actually really fully develop a theological anthropology. He has a few things here and there. I think there's like 7 or 8 separate like works specifically devoted to theological anthropology. But given the fact that he thinks it's so relevant, but he doesn't really like work on it, I thought that was pretty interesting. So why is it important today? I think it's always important. I think it's always important to know who we are, um, how God made us, what he made us for. And I think those are some of the key issues that theological anthropology deals with. Um, what's the human creature's relation to God? That I think that's at the end of the day, that's what theological anthropology tries to address: our relation to God and what kind of creatures we are.
Yeah, and I think probably a lot of people today might hear that and feel like, well, that's interesting. It's something you might pursue, but it's not immediately understandable why that might be relevant. But I'm sure you've worked this out much more than I have, but it's pretty relevant to how you understand Christ. It's pretty relevant to how you understand the atonement. It's pretty
Yeah.
relevant to how you think about today identity. It's pretty relevant to how you think about trans and post-humanism and the
Yeah.
various kind of movements that are talking about augmenting who we are and what we are and our purpose in life. Moving
Yeah.
your consciousness to AI or something like that. We have all these kinds of
Right.
conversations that are, some are quite futuristic, but some are very present. So post-humanism may be future, identity is present, and then I would say, like, in terms of dogma, like basically our Christology is entirely predicated on, not entirely, but is mostly predicated on a kind of understanding of what the human being is.
Yeah.
Now, it might be
Yeah.
useful.
So
Yeah, sorry.
I was gonna say you mentioned a couple of issues there: identity and transhumanism, that kind of stuff. So when I was writing my dissertation, I wanted to focus on some of the more perennial issues. Identity is a really hot issue right now. It's something I think we have to figure out. Transhumanism is a thing we have to figure out because we're going to have to deal with it. But I really wanted to focus on some of the issues that have been talked about and addressed throughout the history of the church. So like image of God, what is a human nature? What is a person? I think that's, we use that term quite a bit without having too much understanding about what exactly it is. Now there are some classical definitions, Boethian definition and stuff. What's humanity's vocation? What are we called to do as human beings? And the final one is, what is our destiny? And I think what you mentioned earlier about how it relates to Christology, I think that's a really important one too. Like what's the end? Like why are we created? What are we for? Where is this all going? I think those are all perennial issues in theological anthropology. And I think those probably should inform the more hot button issues that have come up recently: identity, transhumanism, sexuality, that kind of stuff. I think those other core issues, almost dogmatic issues, although I wouldn't call them dogmatic because they're not enshrined in any of the ecumenical creeds in the same way that like Chalcedon enshrines Christology or Nicaea and Trinitarian theology. But they are issues that they do come up across the history of the church. They need to be addressed in every generation.
I wonder if we could do this just to kind of concretize this. Could I maybe go through the list of some of the things you said and ask you for an unnuanced but understandable definition of like nature and person? So like, let's start with, what's a human nature? How would you define a human nature?
Personally, or what are some
well,
of the
just like kind of
definitions?
your reflection, just a generic kind of definition that you're okay with. We can kind of work through this list because I think it might be helpful. I think theological anthropology is important, but it's hard to make it feel, it seems abstract. So let's try to make it concrete by giving some guts to it. So what's a human nature?
Yeah, so like human nature, I would say, is whatever are the necessary and sufficient conditions for being a human being.
Okay.
Is that too abstract?
Well, that's not too abstract.
And then maybe you can fill that out. Maybe
right.
You can fill out what that list of conditions actually is. Classically, you might think of a human nature being some sort of abstract universal that all things that are human beings participate in. I think that's a pretty classical understanding of a nature that is a human nature is.
Yeah. Okay. So what's required to be a human? I think a lot of people in the past have talked about the kind of immaterial, material side, soul, body, all that kind of stuff. But there's something to be said about what makes an individual. So how would you define a person?
A person, I think I actually fall pretty closely in line with the Boethian definition. So a substance, an individual substance of rational nature. I think that's how I would define a person. And that definition of personhood, I think, can then be parsed out into different types of personhood. So like human beings are persons. They fit that definition. Angels, I would say, fit that definition as well. God fits that definition. You might have a character like Yoda who might fit that definition also. He's not a human person or an angelic person, but he's a Yodic.
So Yoda's a person, but not necessarily a human nature.
Yeah, he doesn't have a human nature, so he's not a human person, but he is a person.
Okay, so we have a human nature, that which is required to be a human irreducibly. A person is an individual expression of a human rational nature. So you talked about purpose or telos. What's the purpose of being a human?
The purpose of being a human is, at the end of the day, I think, to be united to God. I think that's why God created us, in order to be united to him. One, because that's how he's glorified, and two, because that's how we get to enjoy him. So I think that is what, at the end of the day, God made us to be in this intimate union type relationship with him.
And
So
I
it boils
think
down to.
that's helpful. And I think, we were created by God and we return to God in Christ. There's a kind of orderness to it. Now, you mentioned something else, which is the image of God, which is probably the language that most people use today, at least, when they're trying to think about what are we really as humans. So I know there's some controversy around the exact definition of the image of God, but what do you think is a helpful way to describe being created in God's image?
Yeah. So you tend to hear a bunch of typologies about this, and typically there's the threefold typology. One is the image of God has something to do with or substance or structure, and people in that camp will talk about how the image of God is the fact that we're rational, or the image of God is the fact that we have free will. And you have more sort of relational camps, which tend to stress the fact that God is at his core relational in nature, and we are relational in nature, so that's how we image God. And there are more sort of functional accounts, which want to stress the fact that the image is something that we do, and they draw on ancient Near Eastern literature in order to make that claim. I'm not like super happy with parsing these out in such a way that they're completely distinct. I think if you look across church history, even with specific theologians, you find elements of these working their way into how they understand a human being. But I tend to think that more functional account is the more preferable one. I think exegetically, I see a pretty strong basis for that. Even though in the tradition, that hasn't really been emphasized quite as much. There has been an emphasis on humanity's dominion and authority and their rulership, but not necessarily that being the image of God. So Chrysostom, he holds that view, and Calvin is not down with it. He loves Chrysostom, but basically he's like, well, he's right on like most things, but I have no idea how he got that wrong by following this particular view. Peter Martyr Vermigli, he also places a really strong emphasis on function and rulership as the image of God. Wolfgang Massilos does too. So it's there in the tradition, but I think the strongest case for it is made exegetically.
And when you say function, what functions do you have in mind?
I have in mind the function of being vice regents or stewards of God's creation. So you see that right at the beginning of Genesis, God gives dominion to Adam over creation. And the ancient Near Eastern parallels is that oftentimes this ancient Near Eastern ruler would place some sort of statue or image of himself in order to represent the fact that that ruler has authority and presence. I think that's another element that's sort of missed out with this functional view, authority and presence in this particular location. So we're like little statues of God, right. which is I think why there's a prohibition on making graven images, because there is already an image, like we are the image.
So you think humans created in the image of God are the icon of God, and therefore their prohibition? All right, I can go along with that, I think. I mean, Christ is the icon of God in whom we are renewed into the image of God in Christ. So I think there's something to it. Okay, so we have human nature, whatever the irreducible thing that we are. We have person, which is an individualized nature of some sort. We have purpose, which is union with God. And then we have the image of God, which is essentially functional, or no, that's an overstatement because you said it was all the different things, but function is the accent.
Yeah.
And that function is vice regency over the earth. So is there anything we're missing in terms of anthropology that I missed?
In terms of
just like basic definitions.
Yeah, no, I think that covers some of the most key issues in theological anthropology.
Then I think when it transitions then, like there's a couple topics, Christology and atonement. So Christology basically says, you know, the Logos assumed a human nature, but not a human person. He did that so that the only person in Christ is the Word, such that the Word could live and die for our sake as a true and genuine human in his person. So are there any things like in your work, have you kind of correlated the idea of Christology, Christological nature, personhood with this theological anthropology? Like, how do you see that working together? Is it which comes first, Christology or us kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so when you were sort of describing this relation, I think you hit on the really obvious way that those two topics are related. So you can think of it in terms of three questions, like what is the end goal, right? What's wrong, and how do you fix it? And your answer, and your setup for this question, address all of those things, right? What's the end goal? Well, the end goal is union. What's wrong is that we're estranged from God. How do you fix it? That's going to involve Orthodox Christology and figuring out in what ways Christ is fully man, fully human. I think a helpful analogy that I sometimes use when sort of drawing the relationship between these two together is to think of an inanimate object like a car, right? If a car, you know what a car's function is. A car's function is to get you around. But in order to know what that function is, you're going to have to analyze some of its parts. What does an engine do? What do the tires do? How does this fit with that? How does this work together? And if that car is broken down, you're going to need to know what its end goal is, how it's supposed to function if you're going to fix it. And I think that's how atonement draws us into thinking a little bit about theological anthropology. Obviously, Christ saves us. He redeemed us. But what does he redeem us for? To answer that question, you have to look back at what we're created for. I think that's a really obvious way that they're connected. I think there's another way that they're connected. So I wrote a sort of like a paper, kind of a blog, sort of in between. For the Evangelical Philosophical Society, they had like a series of essays on anthropology. And the question that I ask there, or the approach that I ask there, is what account of human nature best makes sense of a particular account of atonement? So what account of human nature best makes sense of a particular account of atonement? And what I had in mind was somebody like T.F. Torrance, who has this robust sense of vicarious humanity of Christ, that Christ is like doing all these things, not just as a substitute, not just as representative, but somehow in a very strong sense for us. And I end up analyzing that and saying, well, if this is actually going to work for him, then human nature needs to be this one thing that everybody participates in. So by asking that, that's just one example, right? By asking that question, what does a human nature need to be in order for this doctrine of atonement to work? I think you can start to get a lot of mileage on anthropological questions.
Well, let's talk about the atonement then. So there's a purpose to bring us to God that has to happen by means of some reconciliation if we're estranged.
Yeah.
I know you've talked about penal substitutionary atonement and so on. So maybe based on what you just said, let's talk about penal substitution, but then let's also talk about what account of humanity we need for that to work. Because you kind of proposed the topic already. So maybe start, if you could, by defining what penal substitution is. And then maybe if you can work into that, what account of humanity is maybe not required, but is fitting for PSA to be true.
Yeah. So there are different versions of PSA. I think PSA is actually sort of a family of views. But there are a few core elements that fall into these different accounts of penal substitution. One is that human beings are sinners. And sinners deserve to be punished for their sin. Second is that Christ undertakes the punishment or the consequences which would have been a punishment if he would have committed them, for that sinners deserve. So there's this idea that there needs to be some sort of consequence for the actions of those human beings, and that Christ takes on that consequence. And third, it's that because of what Christ did, sinners no longer need to undertake that punishment or that consequence because God's justice has been satisfied in Christ. So those are three key elements. There's sin and the penalty. There's the fact that Christ takes this on as a substitute, and that sinners no longer need to take this on themselves because God's justice has been satisfied.
Just before we move on, can I just quickly ask, you mentioned there's a family of variations on PSA, but these are the essential elements. So when I think of that, I think of two basic presentations. I think the early Reformed one, which really focuses on satisfaction. And then I think of more like the late Reformed Scholastic one, which really focuses on, penalty wrath kind of language. Mm-hmm. Not that they overlap for sure. They're the same view from different kind of viewpoints. What other ones are you thinking of? Because when I think of it, I only think of these basic two, maybe on a spectrum. There might be ways to work in.
Yeah. So in recent literature, you'll see some people point out the fact that one, Christ undertakes the actual punishment for sin that sinners deserve. And then there's another view which doesn't want to say that he is in fact punished, but that he takes on the consequences, which, if it had fallen upon sinners, would have been a punishment. So there's a fine-grained distinction between an actual punishment and consequences. And there's reasons for that. There's another sort of discussion that's brought up in regards to this. So you might think that the typical PSA account says that God is required to punish sin. And I think that's how most people would sort of flesh it out, that we need a penal substitute because God is required, according to his justice, to punish it. Now, some people like Karl Moser have brought up the fact that that was not universally held, that there are some who believe that God could have just sort of forgiven it, but for other reasons, he decides to punish it. So there's a difference between God satisfying his justice necessarily through the specific action, and then God perhaps doing it in different ways, and then perhaps God undertaking being a penal substitute because of some other sort of further end. So I think those are families, further distinctions that can be drawn. And then you might think that something like a moral government theory is a really far away cousin of penal substitution, because there's a penal element going on. And in some ways there's a substitution element, but not really.
Let's have a look, because I think sometimes we're so used to hearing it said with one idiom that there's actually a kind of a broad range of theological idioms by which you can describe the kind of reality of penal substitution. I think that's helpful because sometimes like people use slightly different language, but the theological judgment is still virtually the same. Meaning the judgment is we're sinners separated. Christ is not a sinner and dies in their place to satisfy God so that we can be reconciled. Like that might be like the kind of core line.
Yeah, that's like the minimalist. There's a minimalist account. That's what I'd want to call it.
So then transitioning on back to the question of theological anthropology. So you kind of mentioned, we've kind of defined PSA. So what then does PSA require in terms of an anthropological view? Or maybe not require, that's too strong. What is a fitting anthropology?
Yeah, a fitting anthropology. So I think this is going to vary with the different families that you have. But a fitting anthropology, I think probably the core thing that is going to be needed is some account in which you can explain how Christ can become a penal substitute, how Christ relates to all other humans, how all other humans are related to one another. I think you probably need some, at least in my opinion, you need some strong sort of metaphysical account of union that allows him to be a substitute for us. And there are other ways to get it. You can get it through a merely sort of legalistic, not in the legalistic, not in the negative sense, but a merely sort of forensic, sort of federalist kind of way by itself, without any sort of metaphysical union. But I think that the main anthropological point is that you need some way for Christ's action to work for all those who are elect and all those whom he died for.
It's interesting you mentioned both the sort of federal view and the metaphysical. Not that they're separated, but they're emphases.
But they can be. Some people do want to say.
Can't. Oh, interesting. And I'd almost say, like, and I don't know if this is true in terms of all the scholarship, but like the federal view is almost just the sort of historical external correlate to the metaphysical underpinnings of what's actually happening. Like, I don't really view them as opposites. I just kind of view them as two different ways of seeing the problem, or not the problem, the question. Yeah. Where, okay, so Christ is our head, historically, federally, in Adam, or as our king, or however you want to word it. And then, but metaphysically, I mean, there's a kind of a real personal union of humanity and divinity by which humanity can be restored, redeemed, whatever language you want to use. Is that kind of where you're going with this?
That's sort of what I'm thinking, right? So Christ has this sort of federal headship relationship to human beings, all of humanity. But what allows him to have that relationship? Well, on one hand, you can simply say that's how history sort of worked out with Adam, being a descendant of Adam, being a descendant of David, all that sort of stuff. The true and rightful king of Israel and his people. So you could work it out that way. But also you can bring it back to the key anthropological issues like image of God, right? Like, as you mentioned earlier, Christ is the true image of God. And I think that creates another layer of relationship there, in which we can call him our federal head or king, whatever you want to call it, precisely because he has this position as sort of the archetype of humanity. And I think that's one way that anthropology and some end up relating to one another.
It seems like the New Testament's able to use both idioms. I mean, Paul can, Colossians 3:10, Ephesians 4:24, talk about us being renewed into the image of God, Christ, or whatever. But he is also talking about Jesus as the Lord and Messiah, the offspring of David. So there's both idioms being used, the historical idiom and then the metaphysical idiom, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. And the Colossians passage, I think, is really interesting, right? Because you get that image of God sort of language. You get that sort of archetype, forerunner sort of language for humanity. But you also get some of the rulership over creation language that I mentioned earlier with the functional view of the image of God. So that seems all to be sort of weaved in together. And in that Colossians passage, it's precisely because he has these features that he can be the one who redeems us.
He can be what? Sorry, I missed that last
The one who redeems us.
The one who redeems us, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I never thought about that in these terms, but you're right. Colossians does talk about him being the firstborn of creation. He can rule, all this kind of stuff. But that's also connected to his being the image of God, at least in the context. So that's interesting, and he's a creator. So we have that. We have these kind of pictures coming up. So let's go back to PSA for a second. And what are the problems that you see in terms of like dogmatic descriptions of PSA that maybe run into unintended problems in terms of anthropology or Christology? Like what kind of language do we sometimes use and accidentally, because I don't think it's intentional typically, run amok?
Well, I think, I'm just trying to parse out this question. So I think what you might have in mind, is questions about like the Trinity. I know you mentioned theological anthropology, but you said sort of dogmatic issues when it comes to PSA. I think the classic one is that somehow like the Trinity breaks or is disrupted, or now there's two in the Trinity. That could happen. I think that's one of the dogmatic issues that comes up when people try to describe PSA, that they unwittingly end up arguing for something like this. And then once you sort of sit down and explain it, it's like, well, that's not exactly what I want to say. Well, it's like, well, maybe your rhetoric is just too strong, and you've ended up saying something that you never actually wanted to say. So I think that's on the side of people who do favor PSA, I think that might be one of the sort of dogmatic errors that they fall into. Now, on the side of people who critique PSA, there's a similar sort of not Trinitarian enough argument that people make. So if you think of the divine child abuse objection that people often bring up against PSA, that the penal substitution encourages encourages people who are being abused to stay in those relationships, that encourages them to be submissive and not to respond and sort of just willingly take abuse, or that it looks a lot too much like a natural father abusing their child. I think dogmatically that doesn't really work either, because you have a faulty view of the Trinity. So that would work if that objection would go through if the Trinity wasn't a reality, if these were individual, if they were numerically distinct agents, but because the Father, Son, they all share the same mind, share the same will, share the same nature, that sort of objection doesn't actually fall through. So on the PSA side and on the side against PSA, I think there are some Trinitarian issues that need to be dealt with.
I think there might also be an anthropological one too. For example, if you go to the cross, and we view it this way, that there is a kind of transactional forgiveness, which is true, there is. Well, what happens then to our human nature if we don't talk about rational soul and body being redeemed as well? Then we live today and we're still in the muck of it. We're forgiven, but there's no transformation. So I do think this kind of goes to a question I wanted to talk about. That, yeah, there is a penal substitutionary atonement, but that is not disconnected to the other things that Christ does for us in terms of atoning work or in terms of redemptive work. And I think sometimes if we isolate PSA and then ignore the other truths that Scripture teaches on this topic, we get into a place where we're not transformed, we're merely justified. Which I know maybe sounds odd to say, but I think it's a problem. I don't think the early reformers got into this problem, but I think sometimes by how we talk, we accidentally make it sound like, well, we're forgiven because of the double imputation. And now we're just like, okay, cool. But you've talked about Torrance and others, and I know he had a strong view of human nature being redeemed. Can you kind of like talk into that and maybe then connect some of the other atonement perspectives as well?
Yeah, so connecting it to the point you just made, I like to distinguish, and there's a few others who do this too. Eleanor Stump does, Fred Sanders does, but I think it's a really important distinction to make is between atonement narrowly conceived and atonement broadly conceived. Now, atonement narrowly conceived focuses almost exclusively on sort of the paschal action of Christ, his death, his resurrection, his passion. So it's the Passion Week sort of is where atonement is located. Now, people who want to emphasize that would definitely say atonement is a Trinitarian work. It's the work of the Father, Son, and Spirit. They're all involved, but the emphasis lands on what Christ has done in this very short period of time. So that's the narrow one. I think there's also a broad way of understanding it, which atonement just is the entire work of the triune God, which has an emphasis on Christ and perhaps also the Spirit, that brings estranged humanity into union and at one-ment with God. I think that's sort of what you're hinting a little bit about, that the at one-ment, and this is a term Torrance uses quite a bit, the at one-ment of God and humanity happens more than just the cross, right? The at one-ment occurs during Christ's life. That's part of it. It occurs after, when atonement is actually applied, not just accomplished, but it's also applied. And that has the application of the at one-ment has a transformative effect. I mean, how can you be united to God and not be transformed. That in and of itself changes your very identity. It changes who you actually are. You're no longer this sort of individual that's unrooted, or this individual that only relies upon yourself, but you're an individual that's now defined by this relationship with God himself.
I think that's helpful. And kind of going back to, I mean, you mentioned it, our goal is a union with God. And so when we're justified, when we are forgiven because Christ died on our behalf, satisfying the wrath of God due us for our sins, because you're united with Christ, then you have a brand new relationship. And that relationship is, in my view, growing and transforming you from one level of glory to another. Sanctification essentially. But I think there's something too. I think when we isolate maybe penal substitution from the broader conception of atonement, as you mentioned, the broader and narrow, then we sometimes make salvation seem very one-sided. It's merely the forgiveness, but it's forgiveness and then new relationships so that you can do what you were created to do. Am I kind of hitting where you would agree, or how would you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, you are. And I think a good sort of pastoral illustration would be my relationship with my wife, right? So we can talk about that particular day when I got married, when the ceremony occurred legally. There was a change that occurred, but it wasn't just a sort of legal union, right? It's not just this legal fiction. There's an actual relational union that happens there. And because of that relational union, I'm now actually a different person, not in like a numerically distinct person, but qualitatively, I'm a different person after that ceremony than before. And not just legally, but relationally, I'm a different person. And that union, which is now a part of who I am, that should be changing me, that should be transforming me more and more every day as that union, that bond of union is strengthened between my wife and I. So if we can talk about stuff like that when it comes to our human relationships, how much more would that be true when we're talking about our relationship with God himself?
What's interesting, even relationally, what you're saying is like, if I'm married, or when I'm married, on that day, I become husband to my wife, and she becomes wife to her husband. There's a new relational quality that you gain by name, but it's not merely just a name, because it represents something that's real in terms of a new way of relating to someone else, a new way of having a relationship and existing and thinking and moving and so on. And the same thing I think is probably in many ways true. I mean, it's maybe cheesy to say, but his name is Christ and we're called Christians. We relate to him in a brand new way. He's not ashamed to call us brothers, and we're not ashamed to call God our Father. Jesus our brother, God our Father. I know those are kind of finite analogies of sort of a deeper reality, but I think it can be helpful to conceive of in these kind of regular speech
and Luther
words.
brings up the same metaphor when he's talking about the great exchange. He thinks about the great exchange in terms of marriage as a metaphor. I think it's in Bondage of the Will that he talks about it, I think, but he uses this marriage analogy too.
Yeah, well, I think it's helpful because we understand it in regular life that when you get married to someone, you gain a new title. You're married, your husband, your wife, but there's like a whole thing, and then eventually you might become a father or mother, and then a child to be a son or daughter to you as father. And they're not just mere words; they actually signify something beyond the sign of the term. So, okay, that's helpful. I think so. We got penal substitution, theological anthropology. We figured out that you're a doctor. You understand these things, and it was kind of fun to talk to you about them. But I think a lot of people may be hearing some of this. And so my assumption is that most people, when it comes to theological anthropology, have heard very little about it in their lifetime. And it's because it hasn't come up in the past. I think there's a resurgence of theological anthropology, and there's going to have to be because of Christology and the debates that are going to come around that. But I'm curious now, for different kinds of people, what books you might recommend. So for two categories of people. First is like the person maybe who doesn't know about this. This is brand new, so kind of an introductory text. Yeah. But then beyond that, like kind of more someone like you, what books do you like to read? And if you could name a few of them, and then like provide like an annotated bibliography as you're naming them. That would be
Yeah.
especially like why I should read them kind of thing.
Yeah, so in terms of theological anthropology, I think a really helpful introduction is Mark Cortez's Theological Anthropology, A Guide for the Perplexed. That title, I think the title is funny, A Guide for the Perplexed. I think it's just a nicer way of saying for dummies. Do you remember that series of books? Like there was
Yeah.
the yellow cover for dummies, so
Yeah.
it's like Theological Anthropology for dummies. He provides a really helpful introduction, sort of laying out different views. He covers image of God, free will, sexuality. I think there might be one more. So just really key, both the perennial issues and some of the more hot button issues. I think that's a good introduction. I also really, really like, and this might be sort of the next level of if you're getting into it, his book, Resourcing Theological Anthropology. And in that book, he really he really examines how Christology relates to theological anthropology, which is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in doing. And I think that book was actually the impetus for the approach that I took specifically with torrents in my dissertation. So if you think of his book as the approach, mine is sort of an application of the approach to one specific theologian in my dissertation. So that book, I also like Anthony Hoekma's, forgot what the title is. I think it's maybe Created in His Image. It's an introduction to theological anthropology from a pretty reformed, but broadly reformed sort of perspective. I think those are some of the ones that are really helpful when it comes to just like generally like getting into theological anthropology and some of the more perennial issues.
Well, that's helpful. We'll have to, I've read one of those books, so I'm sure I can pursue
Yeah.
the other two anyway. So Chris, man, I appreciate you talking with me and allowing me to learn from you. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.